All right, folks, AP Euro students, our final lecture in our series, number 5, about end of the year content for AP European. So this is going to be about Yugoslavia and the end of that nation and the ethnic cleansing and genocide that takes place, and a couple of etc. items. All right, the last part of your study guide. So, which we'll have a study guide review later this week. I'm sure you're aware of that. So Yugoslavia had been created after World War I. It had then disappeared in World War II and then is recreated after World War II. Yugo means south. Slav, of course, is an ethnic group. These are the people of the Balkan Peninsula, formerly under Greek, Roman, Ottoman, Byzantine control for 2,000 plus years, that had formed a nation together. 5 fingers versus the fist. They unified themselves to defend themselves against foreign oppression, first of Austria, and then the Germans during World War II, and then after World War II of the Russians. So, Yugoslavia consists of 7 places. We have today what's called North Macedonia, Serbia, Kosovo, Montenegro, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, and Slovenia. You don't need to know all that. Don't worry about it. And the guy who held it all together was named Joseph Tito. Tito was the dictator of Yugoslavia from 1948 to 1980. He had decided in the days after World War II that he would not be under Stalinist control. This is the only state in Eastern Europe not under Stalinist control, at least in the main, outside of the Balkan Peninsula itself, outside of Greece and Turkey. Because of the Truman Doctrine, America had supported those two nations. And Tito basically tells Stalin, I'm not doing it. I'm going to be my own man. I'm going to do my own thing. My people are going to be all right. And so they become non-aligned, that third group from the Cold War. Now, they are communist, but they're not Stalinist communists, so no gulags, etc. And they get away with it for a variety of reasons we don't need to get into, but they get away with it. So for 32 years, Tito is the ruler of Yugoslavia and is relatively popular. Again, the purpose of this group is to have these small groups of people brought together to defend themselves against various groups, but in the Cold War era of the Soviet Union. And so what happens over 3 decades is interspersing of these cultures. Serbians live in Bosnia, Croatians live in Slovenia, etc., etc. They all intermingle, intermarry, etc. Now, a couple things. They're very diverse people. The Serbs are Orthodox Christian and use the Cyrillic alphabet. Macedonians, also Orthodox Christian, use Cyrillic. Kosovars are Muslim and use Arabic script. They're mostly Albanians ethnically. Montenegrins are also Orthodox. Bosnia-Herzegovinians are Muslim and use Arabic. And Croatians and Slovenians are Catholic and use the Western Romance alphabet. So different cultures, different languages, different religions, but they're first cousins broadly. They come together to defend themselves against the Soviets. And it all starts to fall apart because of 2 things. In 1980, Tito dies. Think of George Washington. He is the guy that brought everybody together. He's well respected. He's got street cred. He fought in World War II. Everybody appreciates him. When he dies, we start to see fraying at the edges. Like a family, we get nice on Christmas because of Grandma. When Grandma passes, the knives come out. That's kind of what we start to see when Tito passes. Now, the big event is going to be the teetering of communism in Eastern Europe. As the Soviets start to fade, what is the purpose of us being together anymore if we're not afraid of the Soviet Union? Again, the Berlin Wall is 1989. All the nations of Eastern Europe are independent by 89 and 90. The Soviet Union collapses the next year, but they're no longer formidable. We are no longer a threat to the Yugoslavians. So we start seeing in 1990 a push for independence. The Slovenians have the first vote in 1990 in December. 88.5% of their population support Slovenian independence. 88.5. Croatia was also in 1990. They support independence, and that will occur. And so Serbia, these two, whatever. We don't like it, but Serbia dominated Yugoslavia. They're the biggest state. You can see by my beautiful drawing. You can look it up on an actual map as well. They have the highest population. They also have the biggest economy. They get from these surrounding states, they get cheap labor. They get cheap natural resources. These nations becoming foreigners. Now we have to trade with them on a more equitable basis. It's going to lessen our workforce, lessen our military, all those kind of things. So that's the problem the Serbs have, is they don't want to see that take place. And so we start conflict. You'll see what's sometimes called the First Bosnian War. War breaks out in the summer of 1991. The Serbs attack the Croats. The Serbs attack the Bosnians in 92. There are many Serbs living in both countries. Again, Slovenia is kind of a little more distant. We don't worry about them as much. But definitely we're concerned about these 2 nations right here primarily. And so we engage in war. And the Serbs will engage in genocide. they will commit mass rape. They will walk into a village, shoot all the men, rape all the women, getting them to leave, and then they can say, look, we just claimed this land. We didn't. And then try to deny it. There are mass graves. All of those things that we saw in World War II, we will see that again during this time period. The capital of Bosnia, Sarajevo, which is a beautiful city, had hosted a Winter Olympics in 1984. The Olympic Village turns into a battleground, basically, because of the elevated dormitories and the various Olympic venues. So there's like sniper attacks and just horrible, horrible, horrible things. NATO, which is what's the purpose of NATO after the Cold War, but NATO still exists, kind of as a pan-European effort. NATO will bomb Serbian positions in 1995. We will see a treaty in the 1990s called the Dayton Accords, based out of Dayton, Ohio, where we stop the violence. Many people in Bosnia will leave. I've taught many Bosnian students over the years where their parents had left in the 1990s, away from the violence and oppression that was taking place there from the Serbs. Now, the Serbians don't see this. Their leader is a man named Slobodan Milosevic. Milosevic is a national hero. He is just supporting our people and sticking up for Serbs living in these soon-to-be foreign countries, and they'll be taken advantage of. And so he's just defending their rights. No one else saw it that way. And so he will be tried for war crimes. He is at The Hague in the Netherlands under the International Criminal Court's war crimes trial when he has a heart attack a couple years ago and dies during his trial and does not actually get to be tried. The rest of the world is kind of like, darn, it's like when Hitler dies by suicide. We're like, oh no, we don't get to execute him. Of course, we wouldn't do executions in the early 2000s, but we could have imprisoned him for life. But he dies of a heart attack. Most of the world's sad. In Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, they hold parades in honor of him and his contribution to Serbian success. So a little rough on that one. Serbia since then has wanted to join the European Union, talked about it. It would help their economy quite significantly. But there are several leaders, generals, who committed war crimes during this time. And they'd been on the run for a long time. So a couple years ago, the European Union said, for us to even consider you, a couple of generals who we know are probably still alive have got to come to justice. These dudes committed genocide. They must be punished. And what do you know? Within a couple months, we had found these guys. One of them, Karadzic was his name, has actually been found in Belgrade posing as a New Age faith healer, like chakras and crystals. But he'd been a genocidal general in the 1990s. So it's amazing that we didn't know where any of these guys were, and then we put economic pressure on the Serbs to join the European Union, and all of a sudden these guys are found, and we know where they are, and we know what they're doing. Coincidence. Now the other issue is Kosovo. Kosovo was not granted independence. We do get an independent Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Macedonia. Montenegro comes a couple years later, but Kosovo is denied that independence because even though 90% of the population is Albanian, this land has many of the historic monasteries of the Serbian Orthodox religion. And so it was decided it was just too much. We're going to do it. The Kosovars start rebelling in 1999. The United States leads airstrikes against that country. Montenegro declared their independence in 2006. Kosovo in 2008, even though still not formally independent. The American bombing campaign helps end the Serb attack, and they've basically been quasi-independent ever since. If you go to Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, you see a large statue of Bill Clinton, the American president who supported the Kosovars during this conflict. So in the 1990s, which is kind of interesting. Serbia will have to let Kosovo go at some point. The last thing holding them up becoming a member of the European Union is they're going to have to let Kosovo go. And it's been flat out stated, you're going to need to do this. If they don't, then they're never going to join. And they need this economically, so therefore it's going to have to happen at some point. We're putting pressure on them. All right. Now, a couple other issues to end here in terms of content for the fourth period in AP European. We talked about this a long time ago, but the European Union, if you remember, we start the coal and steel community in 1951, 6 nations. The Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Italy, and West Germany have no tariffs on coal and steel trade to help rebuild our societies in the early 50s. That goes so well in 1957. We signed the Treaty of Rome, which is seen as the founding document of the European Union. They called at that point the EEC, the European Economic Community. And it is designed to have no tariffs and no work restrictions or visas, no work visas required as we go across borders in those 6 states. It does very, very well. The economies of Europe recover massively. In the 1950s, there's plenty of work to be done, certainly, especially in the West. And so eventually we see more states join. The British famously joined early in the 70s. That didn't end up working out. We had more responsibilities. We created a European Parliament. Just back in January, I was in Brussels, Belgium, and got to go see the European Parliament and the Museum of European History, which was pretty cool. We see in 1985 the Schengen area, where you can cross a border in that membership group without showing a passport. If you are checked when you land in the first state, but then you can go from France to Germany without showing a passport, encouraging more people to travel to more states. We also signed the Maastricht Treaty in 1999, which creates in 2001 the euro coin. Today there are 27 member states in the European Union after Britain left, now down to 27. We have 19 that use the euro. There is a parliament, there is a European president and a European foreign minister. They don't have a whole lot of power, but there is that organization. There is a common European military force, which again doesn't do a whole lot, but it does exist. So there's discussion of more influence on that. We created in 2007 a process for leaving the European Union with the Lisbon Treaty. And then Britain famously had the vote in the summer of 2016, Brexit as it was called, where barely the electorate, 51.9% of them, voted to leave the European Union. That officially happened finally on January the 31st, 2020, but without a formal agreement. So we have until December 31st this year for there to be a formal agreement for how the Brits will leave the European Union, trade, etc. The Scots overwhelmingly wanted to stay, so this could lead to a Scottish independence vote. We already had one. The Scots barely voted to stay a couple years ago. They may choose to leave this time, and it could also lead to the potential reunification of Ireland. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. There is a possibility because the Northern Irish also voted to stay. So we could end up seeing 2 of the 4 constituent states of Great Britain, United Kingdom, leave and become either independent or part of another country in the case of Ireland. So some interesting developments. Couple other kind of random 20th century things, 21st century things to discuss. We have the Vatican II passed in 1962, where the Catholic Church allows local languages to be the primary language of service. It had been Latin for centuries and upheld by the Council of Trent way back in the Reformation. So we have Vatican II allows native services, and we have some very Catholic nations like Italy and Ireland, who the nature of their religious fervor leads to them to not support a lot of the changes that happened in the late 20th, early 21st century, like the legalization of abortion or gay and lesbian rights, gay marriage, etc., things like that. Now, Ireland currently has a gay prime minister, so we've seen some liberalization of some of those rights over the last couple of years in those countries. A couple other things we see that are in your study guide that we'll mention. You see the Green Revolution, or Green movement. Anytime we see green in politics, that is a party that is usually pretty liberal, where its primary concern is environmental policy. So we see the Greens in coalition in Germany at one point. We have a Green Party in Great Britain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We also see a mass migration of people from former colonies moving to their European former colonizers' homes because they already speak the language for the most part, so it makes the transition of assimilation to a new country much easier. Also because the economies of these European states are in much better position in the 1960s and 70s when these states become independent, so many people moved there. We see sometimes this integrated smoothly into life. We see, for example, in Britain, if you're going out for what they call fast food, oftentimes you'll be getting Indian food. And that's a huge part of the culture for British people now. You also see in some places we have exclusively ethnic neighborhoods where people are not allowed to live separately, kind of like redlining in the United States for African Americans, where we limit people to certain neighborhoods. So we have large neighborhoods of immigrants or people of color who are not treated fairly, who are discriminated against, and it's problematic, certainly, to be the case. And that is an issue. And so it does result in a lot of riots and frustration and protests in those neighborhoods. We also see, of course, therefore, the rise of fundamentalist terrorism, especially in the religion of Islam. That's a movement that starts in the 50s and 60s as anti-Western movement. We see organizations like Al-Qaeda in the 1980s and ISIS in the late 1990s rise up. And we see some terrorist activities that take place 7705 in Great Britain, the attacks in Paris just a couple years ago, like at the Bataclan, those kind of activities. So we do know that it is a problem because oftentimes we have very poor, discriminated against individuals who are frustrated, and because of the internet, especially with ISIS, they're able to reach out and recruit poor, disgruntled people who don't feel like they're part of the culture in these various European states. So that is something that we do see definitely in the last 10 years or so. Also, we see after the end of World War II, the rise of the welfare state, as many governments will slightly increase their taxes and use those tax dollars to help fund public health programs, welfare, unemployment, retirement funds, etc. I mentioned earlier in a previous lecture the NHS, the National Health Service of Great Britain. There is no private insurance. for most people. That is an elective. You can get additional private insurance, especially for the wealthy, but everybody has government health insurance. Everyone sees a doctor. There's no networks because everyone is under government control. And there are certainly some downsides to that system, but like I have taken students abroad before who need medical care, and they will treat foreigners the same as they will treat a citizen of that country. There's no need for health insurance. There's no copay. Sometimes, it's pretty cheap for medicine or any sort of treatment that's needed. It's just a different system in many of those countries. So we see the rise of that, what's often called cradle to grave welfare state, where you are taken care of from the moment you're born to the moment you die. Of course, this causes higher taxes, but those taxes are used to fund those programs. So we see that oftentimes to help fund colleges in some of the Scandinavian countries. You hear some of our political candidates in the 2020 election talk about free college. Of course, it wouldn't be free, but you pay for it through higher taxation. So that's something we've seen in European states. And then we also see a huge movement in feminism. A woman like Simone de Beauvoir, and her book, The Second Sex, and talking about women's rights. We had the right to vote in the early 20th century, what's called first wave feminism. We've then seen second wave feminism, like women having more job opportunities and equality in the home. Third wave feminism, even broader things, and even now we see some people talk about it fourth wave, as without getting into all those details, more opportunities for women outside the home, more women having control of their careers and their bodies, and more women having political office and influence in society instead of traditional male dominance. So we've seen that. Also the issue of LGBTQ rights in various nations, and having those opportunities be created as well. So for the most part, those rights are common across European states regardless of where they are. We still see some like Russia, where those are severely limited and in fact banned in some cases. People cannot get married, or they're persecuted for their sexual orientation. So there's a variety of topics on those issues that we can see depending on what country you're in. So anyway, that's kind of an update on some random kind of details from Europe, but the point is just to know that we have Yugoslavia and then some of those other issues. So I hope these videos have been helpful. Thanks a lot.